In this video, I'm going to explain why I think early access programs for racing simulators can actually be incredibly detrimental, and why, from a consumer perspective, early access is pretty much always a negative thing when it comes to the enjoyment of racing simulators. We'll look at this from multiple angles, and you can tell me in the chat if I'm an idiot or still an idiot but you agree with me. Remember to subscribe so you can unsubscribe when you do disagree with me. You can click the like button, but I can't guarantee anything good will come from it. And a massive thank you to all our channel members and Patreon supporters. If you become a member, you will lose money, but you will have supported this nonsense and get access to terrible emojis. Amazing. So before I go into why I think early access is pretty terrible when it comes to racing simulators, I'm going to mention the big positives of early access and where I think it does work well for racing simulators. So the first really obvious benefit of early access is, of course, cash flow for developers and for publishers to actually make a game happen. The fact of the matter is, some titles just won't take place or occur if it wasn't for some kind of early access to get that cash flow going or to demonstrate that there's an interest in the product. Now, that's not exactly what typically happens now with many racing sims, but it is definitely a big benefit of early access with quite a few titles, and will be the case for some racing simulators. Another great benefit of early access is that the developer can get early user input and testing, and maybe help with deciding which features or aspects of the product should take priority. What is the user base of that specific simulator most interested in? Obviously, you would hope a established developer would have done their research and already know this to a large degree, but you know, you can break things down and you can talk about very hyper-specific aspects of a simulator, and it can be a good way to help direct developer focus for that specific community. Then we have the fact that active testing of components of the game can be really helpful, and mixed into that, the aspect of having a wider audience with loads of different types of computer hardware, sim racing equipment can really be beneficial, especially for racing simulators where there is so many different pieces of hardware, wheels, pedals, monitors, triple screen, VR, you know, there's so much stuff going on. Actually having a really wide selection of users to help test all that stuff and test game crashes and report them back, that is actually a really useful aspect of early access. Though I would actually say that's probably more useful to be done way later in development, and when it comes to a sort of semi-private beta or an alpha, you know, or like a few months from launch, I think that's where that works best. But you know, you can do it early on, so it's not really a negative. I'd say that is generally a positive. Then I would definitely say, and this is something that developers have certainly taken advantage of, is the marketing that developers get through an early access phase and through the early access process. Each time they roll an update, you're going to get loads of YouTubers doing videos on those updates, doing live streams on those updates, and even if a game has a terrible update or is generally a bit rubbish, if you can get the momentum and the ball rolling on YouTubers and influencers and media covering stuff, and the more that you can get them doing that, the more your game is getting general visibility. And counterintuitively, it doesn't really matter if it's negative visibility or positive visibility. Ideally it is positive visibility, but in all cases, just to get your game above the noise and into people's consciousness and to be seemingly relevant is a huge thing, especially for more niche titles when it comes to like simulators, where, you know, it's just really hard to drum up interest in them. So this is actually one of the reasons why me being critical about Evo or LMU when it's coming out, or AMS2 or whatever, when you have someone that's more critical and maybe over the top a bit more negative in some ways relative to how anodyne most content creators are, it's still actually massively good promotion, and we're actually doing the developer a favour. At least that's what I tell myself, to make myself not feel like a terrible person. But yeah, no, if people are talking about something, even if it's bad, it's going to be marketing, and that's better than people not talking about something. And well, you don't know what they're not talking about, do you? So how do you think about it for yourself? How can you argue it? Why would you even try it out for yourself? Exactly, that's my point. So those are the main positives, but now we move on to the negatives, and why I personally would argue that early access when it comes to racing simulators have actually made sim racing worse, the experience of racing simulators, and maybe even the racing simulators themselves worse, and why I think it's also on aggregate damaging sim racing. So the big one, or the big negative that really stands out, is that you have developers and publishers that are doing early access that could easily afford to do the development without early access, or they could have found a traditional publisher, or they could have found other funding rather than having to go through early access. So they're basically taking money off people with the promise of a product when they could have taken it off business people that have more money to spend effectively than your average sim racing peasant, because obviously we know sim racers are incredibly poor, with them only spending a few £1,000s on sim racing hardware. But that's another argument. But yeah, there's obviously business will take advantage of whatever it can. It doesn't care on the ethics. It will just be, can we get more money and make this a lower risk business endeavour? Another big aspect is that making a project live and doing an early access massively, not always, but almost always, massively slows down the development of that game. Even when something's early access and it's changeable and the developer's moving things here and there and doing God knows what with it, when you have something live, you still have to maintain it to some degree. You still have to adjust certain things. You still have to patch an update that you've rolled out to the early access. You still have to communicate with the general public and explain why the current early access is messed up. You still maybe have to explain why the multiplayer is breaking people's wrists from a car flying in their face. It doesn't even matter if it's the beta branch of the early access. You're going to have to communicate with the public. You're going to have to do stuff that is going to take away time from development. Also, the public will have seen the game, and they will have already started to build up a perspective and an expectation. So you're already locking yourself down and trapping yourself in some ways from being able to have the freedom of maybe going in a completely different direction, or maybe completely re-evaluating the project. This is something a lot of sim racers aren't really aware of, or a lot of games players aren't aware of, or a lot of film consumers aren't aware of. But with a lot of creative projects, if you've ever produced music as well, or just done painting, right? Sometimes something is not going to go to your original plan at all, and sometimes, in fact very often, you make mistakes, or you do stuff, or you discover things that mean actually you're much better off going in a totally different direction. Your landscape painting might be much better as some other type of painting. Maybe the focus is on like a building in that landscape, even if that wasn't the original intention. If you're making some music, you might accidentally come up with a banging techno beat or a jazz beat or something else and go, hang on, I'm going to completely abandon the original idea of making some soft house, and I'm going to go full techno with it because I've discovered something that's really makes much more sense to capitalise on. And with racing simulators, you could be the case that you go, well, with the current tech we've got, with the engine we've got, and where we are with this, it makes more sense, instead of doing a very complex product, to maybe hyper-focus on a specific component so that we can meet the intended launch period or the development time, rather than us having to meet this ginormous infinite project scope that we've presented to everybody. So that setting expectations for the consumers and sort of getting the project locked down too early can be a real negative for in terms of the end resulting product and how good that end resulting product can be. The developer has really lost a lot of creative freedom. Now, I'd also say as well, when it comes to early accesses, you end up with a large amount of consumer fatigue of the product by the time the product launches and is sort of 1.0 version. So I'd say this kind of applies to some degree with like Automobilista 2 and Le Mans Ultimate. The ideal hope is that, you know, your early access audience is just one part of the audience, and when you launch you find a wider audience that haven't been exposed to the suffering of the early access. However, with a small niche like sim racing, it can be that players have just played the game to death in the early access, and the core user base is basically done with the title when it's finished. And that's if it even is properly finished. It could be that version 1.0 still isn't really fully polished, and it's kind of like a weird continuation of an early access. Again, that is something that's incredibly common with racing simulators. You could argue, again, Automobilista 2 kind of feels like it's still a bit of an early access title in many ways, or it certainly did for at least a year, 2 years after it technically came out of early access or its earlier versions. Le Mans Ultimate, even now, still feels like in many ways an early access title. And then what I think happens with this is that you never feel like you've got this like actual product. You kind of, when a developer has gone into this early access thing, they sort of get into this kind of game as a service, but without the pressure of having to deliver a rounded, polished, finished thing. So the developer gets into this kind of game as a service mindset, and they're like, well, we fix that, we fix this, we try and do this, we try and do that. And the end result from a player's perspective is you end up with a real sort of hodgepodge, never really satisfying end product. And I would argue like some of the best works of art normally have a kind of focused, obvious thing about them that's then encapsulated and well-rounded. They might not be perfect, but as an entity in and of themselves, they just make cohesive sense. And when that doesn't happen, that's when you end up with something that's just universally a bit crap. I mean, like Game of Thrones, fantastic, 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 but the last 2 seasons were so bad, it literally ruins the entire thing as an artistic experience, as a thing to watch and do. Be a bit like if you've got a really great song, but one of the choruses is completely unfinished, you know? It just wouldn't make sense. You need stuff to be cohesive, solid and whole to generally really get the maximum enjoyment out of them. And I think that was the thing with older video games, mostly because of not having the internet to update things on the fly. Games had to be a polished package, and they had to have at least a certain amount of single player, certain amount of multiplayer, or a certain amount of things to do, and a certain amount of polish. They had to be kind of cohesive to a certain degree. And so, you know, if you bought something, you as a consumer would have trust that you're getting some kind of actual coherent game. There's a box with a thing in it that offers a coherent thing. And that, with early access, I think is actually really quite rare now. Though even without early access, games release really buggy, and, you know, as I say, it's a lot of the online patching ability and just the acceptance of games being terrible quality at launch. That's obviously been detrimental to it as well. So, and I think this is particularly relevant in the sim racing space, we then end up with a situation where you have so many titles in this sort of early access thing going on, where they never feel quite right, they keep changing, they're never totally coherent, and they don't seemingly ever come out of early access, that the consumer just gets utterly fatigued with it and starts just getting into a mindset of, well, I don't care about the next one. It's going to be 5 years till the game comes out. I just don't care. And I think they do generally just lose interest in the new titles. I think it really does damage potential future sales of these simulators. And I think people might end up missing out on what could be really good games in the future, because they'll be like, well, I just can't take it anymore. I've tapped out. On the other side, though, I think this does open things up for developers that are actually doing closed betas and then just launching a full title. I think when it comes to games like Project Motor Racing, with them doing more of a traditional launch without the slow roll early access, I think that actually makes people a lot more hyped and excited for it, and maybe more likely to pre-order a new title. Who knows? Maybe not. But I think there's a lot more hype behind Project Motor Racing than there is for Evo now, which is not how you would have predicted things, given the excitement behind Assetto Corsa and the excitement behind Kunos and you know, its size and its fan base. And looking at Assetto Corsa Evo's early access in particular, I can see that getting the cash flow with the initial launch of it has been beneficial for 505 and Kunos, but from a consumer's perspective, I'm not quite sure who it's being good for. It's like diluting the perception of the product. Even if Kunos turn it around and do a fantastic job, I think it's going to take a long time to recover from the bitter taste of the messy early access. And again, I think that's the case with LMU as well. I think it took quite a lot to really get people to start coming around to it. Maybe I'm totally wrong about this, but this is my vibe of early access, and I really don't think it's been good for sim racing. I don't think you can beat that excitement of getting a box. That's how old I am. I'm still using boxes. It's all digital now. It's all in the cloud. But getting that box and it's like, oh, it's GTR 2 or it's Richard Burns Rally or it's GoldenEye on the N64. Yeah, but you know, even digitally, games come out, I'm buying it, I'm playing through it. Bloody fantastic. It's like I'm actually getting a cohesive thing and I'm enjoying it rather than feeling like some abused free beta tester or a paid beta tester. I've worked in the games industry and it's actually absurd that people are paying to be beta testers and the developers literally want them to give feedback as if they were professional beta testers. And the developer will be like, well, you get a discount on the game, guys, you're so lucky to play it early with a discount. It's like, guys, you're doing work. The developer should be paying you. They should maybe limit the numbers and pay you. So, I don't know. As I say, the reality is, business is very good at finding ways to externalise the cost and internalise the profit. And I don't care if it's at the expense of the joy of a product, it's all about the money. And that's how the world operates. Be interested to know what people think in the chat. Be interested if people got to the end of this. This video is far too talky. It's a bit like a bloody podcast, and I don't do podcasts. But if you did, let's have a teapot and a teacup and a fish emoji. Congratulations. Thanks for watching this. Till the next one, happy tea drinking, take care, and goodbye.